Life Stories presents tales that inspire, teach, and touch the heart. Today's story begins on an ordinary bus ride in Chicago, where an unexpected encounter turns into a powerful lesson on respect, empathy, and the quiet strength forged through life's toughest battles. When a group of teenagers mocks an elderly man, they have no idea he's a Vietnam veteran carrying decades of wisdom and resilience. What follows is a moment of transformation, not just for them, but for everyone watching. Subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we uncover the profound moments hidden in everyday life. Let's begin today's story. It was one of those days when everything seemed unremarkable. The kind of evening where the hum of the city settled into a rhythm, cars honking in the distance, the shuffle of footsteps on sidewalks, and the occasional bursts of laughter from strangers passing by. The 5:15 bus to downtown Chicago was packed, as it often was, with people eager to return to the comfort of their homes after a long day. The air inside the bus was thick and slightly stale, mingled with faint scents of takeout food and warm coats. I had boarded a few stops earlier, finding a seat near the middle. My eyes wandered over the passengers, most of whom seemed preoccupied. A man in a sharp grey suit adjusted his tie while poring over a newspaper, and a young woman scrolled endlessly on her phone, her earbuds barely containing the muffled rhythm of a pop song. It was ordinary, almost dull until he stepped onto the bus. The man was older, probably in his 70s. His face was weathered, each line a story etched by time. His dark brown skin had the sheen of resilience, and his posture carried a quiet dignity that set him apart. He wore a simple but neat outfit, a well-worn coat and slacks pressed so meticulously they almost felt ceremonial. He leaned on a cane as he moved, the kind of cane that didn't just support his body but seemed to hold a lifetime of battles and memories. No one gave him much notice at first. He settled into a seat near the front, his hands resting on the cane with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. But then they entered a group of teenagers, 5 or 6 of them, their laughter sharp and loud as they bounded onto the bus. They were brimming with that reckless confidence of youth, their swagger declaring to the world that they owned it. Among them, a lanky boy with a bright red Yankees cap stood out. He was the loudest, the one whose grin carried a mix of mischief and defiance. His friends followed his lead, egging each other on as they scanned the bus for something or someone to amuse themselves with. It didn't take long for their eyes to land on the elderly man. Red Yankees cap nudged his friends, whispering something that drew snickers and nudges. The man, staring out of the window, seemed oblivious or perhaps chose not to notice. His silence only emboldened them. "Hey, old man," Red Yankees cap called out, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. Heads turned slightly, but most passengers quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. "What's the cane for? You lose your walker or something?" The man didn't flinch. He kept his gaze steady on the city streets blurring past the glass. The boy smirked, encouraged by the lack of reaction, and stood up, swaying slightly as the bus hit a bump. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Grandpa," he taunted, leaning closer, his voice dripping with mockery. His friends chuckled, their laughter sharp and hollow, bouncing off the metal walls of the bus. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably, their unease palpable. Some glanced at the boys, others at the old man, but no one said a word. It was easier, safer, to pretend they hadn't noticed. I caught a flicker of movement, the old man's fingers tightening ever so slightly around the worn wood of his cane. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. He didn't turn, didn't react, but in that small gesture, there was something, an unyielding strength, perhaps, or patience that most of us could only aspire to. Still, Red Yankees cap pressed on. "Bet you're waiting for someone to carry you home." "Ha," he sneered, his grin widening as his friends burst into another round of laughter. The man finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his eyes, deep and steady, turned just enough to meet the boy's gaze. It wasn't an angry look. Nor was it fearful. It was something else entirely: calm, deliberate, and resolute. For a brief moment, the boy faltered. His smirk wavered, and his voice caught in his throat. But pride is a stubborn thing, and it wouldn't let him back down. He squared his shoulders, leaning further into the man's space as if to reclaim his dominance. The bus rattled on, its passengers frozen in tense silence. You could feel the collective anticipation, the sense that something was about to break. "Come on. Say something," the boy jeered again, his voice losing a bit of its edge. "What's the matter? Too good to talk to us?" And then, finally, the man spoke. His voice was low but carried a weight that silenced the laughter in an instant. "Respect," he said, his tone measured and calm, "is a lesson some people only learn the hard way." The words hung in the air, heavier than the sounds of the bus's rumbling engine or the occasional screech of its brakes. There was no anger in his voice, no attempt to intimidate, but the weight of his words cut through the boy's bravado like a knife. For the first time, Red Yankee's cap seemed unsure. His eyes darted to his friends, who were now unusually quiet, their grins fading into awkward, nervous glances. "Oh. So he talks now," the boy retorted. But the sharpness of his tone had dulled. "Respect? Heh. That's rich coming from someone who can't even stand up for himself." The man's gaze didn't waver. "You think strength is loud, don't you?" he said, his voice calm, almost soft. "You think it's in the noise you make, the way you try to tear others down. But you have no idea what strength really looks like." The bus felt smaller then, the air thick with tension and unspoken thoughts. Passengers who had been trying to avoid the scene now couldn't look away. Even the boy's friends seemed unsure, their laughter a distant memory. The young man in the Red Yankee's cap took a step back, his bravado shrinking under the weight of the old man's steady gaze. As the bus jolted to a stop at a red light, the silence stretched, heavy and expectant. The man turned his head slightly, breaking the stillness with a long, measured exhale. He looked out of the window for a moment as though seeing something far beyond the Chicago streets. But the story was far from over. This was not just a lesson for the boy, it was a lesson for all of us. One that none of us on that bus would soon forget. The red light seemed to hold longer than usual, as if giving everyone on the bus time to absorb what had just been said. The boy in the Red Yankee's cap, his earlier bravado now visibly cracked, stood there, unsure of what to do next. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter and teasing long gone. The passengers, who had been pretending not to notice, were now fixated on the scene, their discomfort blending with a mix of curiosity and tension. The old man turned his gaze back to the boy. His posture, though steady, carried an almost imperceptible shift. He wasn't leaning back to retreat, nor leaning forward to confront. He simply sat tall, his presence commanding respect without demanding it. "You remind me," the man said, his voice calm but firm, "of someone I used to know." Red Yankee's cap blinked, his mouth twitching into what might have been a sneer if not for the hesitation in his eyes. "Oh yeah," he said, trying to sound unfazed. "Who's that? Some old war buddy?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the weight of the moment settle before speaking again. "No," he said quietly, "a young soldier. Just like you." He thought he was untouchable, too. Thought the world owed him something. He learned otherwise. The words were simple, but they carried a depth that silenced even the faint murmur of the bus engine. Passengers leaned forward slightly, their curiosity growing. The tension was no longer about whether the man would respond but about what he would say next. The boy's smirk faltered, his shoulders stiffening. "Whatever. Man," he muttered, glancing back at his friends for support. But they had gone quiet, their earlier amusement replaced by an almost palpable discomfort. One of them, a stocky kid wearing a backward cap, shifted in his seat, his gaze darting to the floor. The old man's lips curved into a faint smile, not mocking, but knowing. Careful. Son, he said. Sometimes the stories we dismiss are the ones that could save us the most pain. He adjusted his cane slightly, resting both hands on it as if grounding himself. For a moment, his eyes seemed to lose focus, staring past the boy, past the bus, and into a distant memory. You see this cane, he said. His voice low but steady. It's not just a stick. It's a reminder. Every scar on my body, every ache in these old bones, comes with a story. Stories of battles fought not with fists, but with courage, discipline, and honor. The boy shifted uncomfortably, his bravado slipping further. Yeah. Well, that's your story, he said. His tone quieter now, almost defensive. What's it got to do with me? The man's gaze sharpened, locking onto the boy's. Everything, he said. Because I've seen where this path leads. I've seen boys like you, so full of pride, so sure of yourselves, break when the world shows you its real strength. You think disrespect makes you powerful? It doesn't. It makes you weak. And one day, when you meet someone who won't walk away, you'll learn that the hard way. The bus jolted forward as the light turned green. The boys' friends fidgeted in their seats, their faces pale and uncertain. Across the aisle, a young woman who had been watching intently glanced out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She looked as though she wanted to speak but didn't. Red Yankee's Cap opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. But they didn't move. The man leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. You don't have to like me, he said, his voice softening just enough to carry a thread of empathy. But you should learn to respect yourself. Because the way you're acting now, it tells me you don't. The boy flinched at the words, as if they struck a nerve. His pride wrestled with the shame creeping into his expression. He turned away, muttering something under his breath that even his friends didn't catch. The old man sighed. A long, measured exhale that seemed to carry the weight of decades. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, almost reflective. You don't know what it's like to carry the weight of someone else's sacrifice, he said. To owe your life to someone who didn't make it back. Every day, I wake up and remember their faces. My brothers in arms. Gone because they stood up when it mattered most. And here you are, throwing away your dignity for a laugh. The bus grew even quieter, the only sound the faint hum of the engine. Passengers who had been looking at their phones or out the window now turned their full attention to the man. Even the boy's friends, once so eager to join in the taunting, seemed caught in the gravity of his words. You're lucky, kid, the man continued, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper, sorrow, perhaps, or hope. Lucky you don't have to learn these lessons the way I did. But keep going like this, disrespecting people, thinking the world owes you something, and you'll find out soon enough. And when that day comes, you'll wish you'd listened. For a moment, no one spoke. The boy stared at the floor, his face flushed, his earlier defiance completely gone. His friends exchanged awkward glances but didn't say a word. The passengers sat frozen, each one seemingly lost in their thoughts, reflecting on the unexpected wisdom that had just unfolded before them. The bus rumbled on, but something had changed. The atmosphere, once tense with confrontation, now felt heavy with introspection. The old man straightened slightly in his seat, his grip on the cane firm but relaxed. His eyes swept over the bus briefly before returning to the window. It wasn't just a moment for the boy, it was a moment for everyone. A silent reminder that respect and strength come from understanding, not intimidation. The bus rattled on, but the energy had shifted entirely. It was no longer just a bus ride, it was something else entirely. Something transformative. The man sat quietly, gazing out of the window once more, his cane resting across his lap. But the weight of his words lingered in the air. their impact etched into the silence that had fallen over the passengers. Red Yankee's cap remained standing, his fists now shoved deep into his pockets. His shoulders were hunched slightly, his posture deflated. He cast a glance toward the old man. But it wasn't the same mocking gaze from earlier. This was different. His expression was a mix of guilt, shame, and something else, something harder to define but unmistakable. Reflection. Maybe. His friends were unusually quiet as well, their earlier bravado replaced by awkward stillness. The boy with the backward cap rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Another boy, who had been laughing the loudest earlier, now looked out the window, his face pale and tight. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she addressed the elderly man. "Sir," she said, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "That was brave. What you said. I mean." The old man turned to her, offering a small, weary smile. "It wasn't bravery," he said, his voice carrying a calm humility, "just something that needed to be done." Her lips parted as if she wanted to say more, but she stopped herself, nodding slightly before looking down at her lap. There was admiration in her gaze, but also something else, regret. Perhaps. For not stepping in sooner. At the back of the bus, a young man who had been silent the whole ride now leaned forward. He was wearing a pair of headphones slung around his neck, and his voice, though tentative, carried across the space. "Vietnam, right?" he asked, his tone respectful but curious. The old man glanced at him, his expression unreadable for a moment before he gave a small nod. "Yes," he said simply. "My grandfather served there," the young man continued. He never talked about it much, but when he did, his voice trailed off, and he glanced down at his hands, rubbing his palms together nervously. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "For what you did. For what you gave." The old man's lips curved into the faintest smile, one tinged with both pride and sorrow. "We all gave something," he replied. "Some of us more than others." The words hung in the air, heavier than the rumble of the engine beneath them. Several passengers nodded quietly, their faces somber as they absorbed the gravity of what he had said. It was more than gratitude, it was an acknowledgement of the sacrifices that allowed them the lives they lived now. Red Yankee's cap shifted uncomfortably, his head hanging low as he stared at his shoes. The stocky boy with the backward cap finally cleared his throat, his voice barely audible. "Sir," he said, his face flushed. I'm sorry. We shouldn't have said those things." The man turned toward him, his expression softening slightly. "Apology accepted," he said. "But remember, respect isn't something you give just because someone demands it. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do." The boy nodded quickly, his face still red, and looked away. Red Yankee's cap didn't say anything, but he shifted in his seat, clearly wrestling with his thoughts. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet introspection that seemed almost foreign to him. The bus slowed as it approached the next stop, the familiar hiss of the brakes breaking the silence. The old man glanced out of the window, his eyes scanning the street corner with a mix of familiarity and detachment. He tapped his cane lightly on the floor, then rose to his feet. His movements were deliberate, steady, as though each action carried its own sense of purpose. Before he stepped off, he turned to face the bus, his voice carrying over the hum of the engine. "Kindness and respect cost you nothing," he said, addressing no one in particular yet speaking to everyone. "But withholding them can cost you everything." The door hissed open, and he stepped off the bus, his gait steady despite the years etched into his frame. The passengers watched him go, his presence lingering even after the doors closed behind him. The bus pulled away from the curb, and the silence inside was thick with contemplation. Red Yankee's cap stared out the window, his reflection faint against the glass. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his hoodie. His earlier confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. His friends sat scattered, their heads down, their energy subdued. The young man at the back leaned against his seat, his eyes closed as though lost in thought. The middle-aged woman near the front pulled out her phone but didn't use it, her fingers brushing absently over the screen. Across the aisle, the young woman who had been glued to her phone now stared at the empty seat where the old man had sat, her reflection mirrored in the glass. The lesson wasn't just for the boys. It was for all of us. Every person on that bus carried something with them, a reminder of the power of dignity, the importance of respect, and the weight of the stories we don't see. It was a wake-up call. Not just about how we treat others, but about the unseen battles they've fought and the quiet strength they carry. As the bus continued down the road, the atmosphere remained heavy with thought. Conversations that had once been casual whispers were now subdued or non-existent. For some, the old man's words would be forgotten in time, lost in the noise of everyday life. But for others, they would linger, a reminder of the values that truly matter, and the lessons we should all take to heart. As the bus rolled on, the old man's words continued to echo in the minds of everyone on board. His quiet strength and unwavering dignity had left an indelible mark, not just on the teenagers who had mocked him, but on every passenger who had witnessed the exchange. The lesson was simple, yet profound: respect, kindness, and empathy are not weaknesses, they are the true measures of strength. Red Yankee's cap sat silently, his earlier bravado replaced by a pensive stillness. Across the bus, passengers exchanged knowing glances, their collective silence speaking louder than words. Everyone had been reminded that behind every face is a story, a journey filled with battles, sacrifices, and triumphs we may never fully understand. As the bus neared its final stop, the air felt different, less tense, more reflective. It wasn't just a commute anymore, it was a shared moment of growth. The old man had left, but his presence lingered, a reminder that sometimes the simplest moments carry the deepest lessons. If this story moved you, share it with others and help spread its message of compassion and respect. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more real and inspiring tales that celebrate the strength of the human spirit.